This is Pantheon Plus, a podcast where we go beyond tights and flights to explore other genres in movies from the past. Each month, we'll have a theme. This month, we look back at the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and each week we will pick a movie related to that theme. This week, we will look at Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring.
This task was appointed to you, and if you do not find a way, no one will.
He was chosen to destroy a ring of power.
I cannot do this alone.
It will take courage to protect him.
You will face the evil.
They're coming.
Aragorn! Get back! I do not fear them.
And loyalty to save him.
Fight hard, don't look back.
If you want him, come and claim him.
The Lord of the Rings. Directed by Peter Jackson. Rated PG-13. Starts December 19th.
My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you could do so by following us on Twitter at HeroPantheon. My co-host for this week and the designer of our brand new logo, which you should see as our Twitter header at this point, is Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. And Brian, we are no longer talking about superhero movies at this point, and that is very exciting because we will be moving on to other genres, other franchises. We have a number of ideas that we will be executing over the course of these next few months, but these are movies, Brian, that I've wanted to revisit for quite some time, and I specifically have wanted to rewatch the extended editions of Lord of the Rings. But Brian, the problem is, in life, because there's so much content, we are such busy people, there's no time, but we are not allowed to leave our houses right now, so what better time to watch extended versions, 4-hour cuts of the Lord of the Rings than right now. So that's what we're doing, Brian, as this month we will be reviewing not the theatrical versions, but the extended editions of The Lord of the Rings.
Yes, it's nice to have a little break from all the superhero movies we've been going through the last 2.5 years, I think, at this point. But it's cool because to me, Lord of the Rings, especially the Fellowship of the Ring, was like, I don't know, like the first movie to really bring us, it feels like to me, to bring us into the modern era of this epic movie, big budget, CGI, epic fantasy filmmaking, you know what I mean? Like, it was the first time that I saw a movie where, like, it was 3 hours, it was an epic journey, and it had, like, amazing CGI, and I'm still astonished at, like, the CGI that they were able to do in 2001 for this movie, and then you compare it to movies, I don't know, I mean, god damn, look at some of the CGI we've seen in some of these superhero movies in the last 5 years, and how bad it is in comparison, and still, like, today, in comparison 20 years later, I mean, god, the Golem, the Balrog, I mean, all those little things that they did with the CGI, and then the sets, everything looks amazing still to this day. I think Lord of the Rings really holds up, and to me, the extended editions really fly by. Like, every time I watch Lord of the Rings, whether it's on TV, whether I saw multiple times in the theaters, or when I bought the DVDs back in the mid-2000s, man, they would just fly by. They never felt like, you know, like, I'm bored. Anytime I was watching a Lord of the Rings movie, I never felt bored, because all those scenes just flow, and are well edited, and the music just keeps it flowing, and yeah, it's a great fun time for me, because even when I watched The Fellowship the other day, extended cut, it's 3.5 hours, and I'm just flowing by, and then I'm looking at the time, like, whoa, shit, it's been 3 hours? And then, you know, it's great stuff, especially with the music. I think it just makes it flow so well.
I think the extended editions, and we'll get into this, they're a little bit on the shaggy side, but that is by design. And again, we are consciously making a decision to go and discuss the extended editions. I will tell you right up top that I think I generally prefer the theatrical versions, because I think just the flow is a little bit better. But I think it's always an interesting exercise to go and watch the extended editions. And unfortunately, I no longer have the copies of the extended editions with all of the special features. I did rebuy them on digital through Amazon. Do the Blu-rays that you just purchased, does it have all the bells and whistles and the 12 hours on each movie of documentaries and featurettes and whatnot?
Yes, they do. Well, they kind of went cheap with it because each movie is 5 discs, right? They split it up, part A and part B on the first 2 discs, and then they go to DVD for the other 3 discs for the documentary. So it's just weird because they practically just took the leftover copies of the DVDs they had from the extended editions, slapped it into Blu-ray copies, so that way they didn't have to transfer over the documentaries into Blu-ray, basically. So they kind of saved some money there, but I do have them. And it's funny, too, because the version that I bought, I guess it was like an international copy, because on the cover it's got like French subtitles underneath. I guess it came from like, I don't know, like French Canada, or you know what I mean? And it's got like these subtitles on it, so I thought that was pretty funny. So my copy's an international copy, but it still plays. But hey, I got to use $50, totally worth it, because everywhere else is probably like $80 new, with taxes like 90 something bucks, and then Amazon is taking a little extra time to ship. So I feel like I got lucky, except mine is French subtitles.
Okay, so let's get into some notes before we get into our categories. And we still do have categories. We're not going to be necessarily ranking movies as we have in the past, but we are still going to go through a couple of planned things. So originally, Miramax was the first studio to express an interest in Peter Jackson's interpretation of the books, but they wanted one movie, and unlike The Hobbit, which we may get into at some point, this is not the kind of movie that this is not the story that you can tell in one movie. You absolutely need to do it in 3 movies. And Jackson refused, and in just a matter of weeks he had to find another studio for funding. He was prepared to settle for 2 movies, but eventually New Line Cinema, which is now owned by Warner Brothers, they made a pitch, and it was agreed that the movie would indeed, or this story would be told in 3 movies, shot simultaneously in New Zealand, and we'll get into some of the details of that. But I think we can both be thankful that Miramax were not the people that actually funded this movie.
Yeah, otherwise it'd have some really tough licensing issues right now with the whole debacle of their owner. But none of that stuff. But yeah, I still can't believe he convinced these producers to give him that much money. I don't know. It felt like a gamble. It really felt like a gamble, this whole concept, because Hollywood had really not done this before. Maybe Back to the Future 2 and 3, but they had already built, that financing based on the first one. This one is completely fresh. It's like, okay, we're going to build this new franchise. These books are popular, but you look at the budget. The first one, Fellowship of the Ring, is like $90 million. Today, that's like, what, 140, 150 almost? And it's like, yeah, we're gonna gamble on that. And it's New Line Cinema, and New Line Cinema is not like, like these big budget, you know, epic movie people. They do like Rush Hour, Nightmare on Elm Street, stuff like that. So I'm just kind of like thinking, looking in hindsight now, like how in the world did he convince them, man? Because what did he do before? The Frighteners, right? That was really good. I saw that on TV as a kid. That was entertaining, but that's not nearly the epicness of a Lord of the Rings movie. And then, looking back on his other stuff, like I've seen Brain Dead, his horror movie, and that's just grotesque and unbelievably gory. And I don't even know how he got away with that with the censors, but he did it. And then you're telling me he convinced them to get 90 million. I mean, not even just 90 million. It's probably what 200 million combined to make all 3. Credit to him for convincing them, because I don't know if I would have had the balls to put that money up and take a gamble like this. But the risk totally paid off, because it's probably the most financially profitable movies in the history of New Line. So there you go.
This movie, Two Towers, Return of the King, they were filmed simultaneously, as mentioned before. It was shot over a period of 274 days in 16 months, and this is the same amount of days that it took to film the movie Apocalypse Now. Thankfully, this movie, unlike what happened to Francis Ford Coppola on the set of Apocalypse Now, thankfully, Peter Jackson did not lose his mind and almost go completely off the rails, as Mr. Coppola did on the set of Apocalypse Now.
No, but he did gain a significant amount of weight if you can see the before and after photos, man, because he was a thin dude in the mid 90s, and then he lost all the weight again after Lord of the Rings. But I'm just saying, man, he put on some weight there. You can tell.
Looking at some of the casting, one of the things that you really learn to appreciate is the fact that you have a nice mix of people who are very much fans of this franchise before it became a movie franchise, became fans of the books, and then you have people who are virgins, who are novices. Christopher Lee is the type of person who is not a novice. He read The Lord of the Rings once a year until his death in 2015 and had done so since these books were published, which is pretty remarkable. He is also the only member of this cast and of the crew ever to have met the original author J.R.R. Tolkien, and I think it is a nice tribute to him and to the series that they did cast Christopher Lee. He is known mostly for his horror work. He also appeared in a really bad James Bond movie, but for the most part he's been in a lot of B-type movies. So to see him in something like this, and then he even would go on to play a small role in the Star Wars prequel trilogy around the same time. So Christopher Lee is somebody who I think a lot of fans will know for mostly those two things, but I think for older people, they are going to know him from his horror movies and James Bond.
Yeah, and it's great casting too because his voice is like, it sounds evil, man. And I know I've seen some of his clips of his horror movies on YouTube, the random ones from England and stuff like that. And he can play a good guy, but even though he's playing a good guy, he still sounds like an evil son of a bitch sometimes. But for this role, the turn that he gives on Gandalf, it's perfect the way he does that speech and the way I don't know, man. He pulls off real evil wizard real well, man, and he did a great job, I thought. And he must be. I mean, he was really in tune with the character, being knowing that he's a big fan of the series, so he probably knew how to approach the Sauron character and the evil shadiness of the character, and he approached it well. Because man, he really did it well, and especially I think he does it even better in Two Towers. We'll get to that next week, but I think it was great casting on him, and it was pretty cool to see him, and then Attack of the Clones. Yeah, I was just kind of tripping out because I was like, oh shit, that's Sauron. And then you realize that Christopher Lee, I mean, at the time when I'm watching it, I don't realize the legend that Christopher Lee was. And then, being the cinephile that I grew up to be, looking back on his history, it's like, goddamn, it's like a really perfect casting, the right time in his career, and it was the perfect way to introduce this older generational actor to this younger generation.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much I appreciated having his presence, and I think he adds so much, as does Ian McKellen and so many other people, and we'll get to them in just a couple minutes here. But Stuart Townsend infamously was originally cast as Aragorn, but he was replaced by Viggo Mortensen after 4 days of shooting because Peter Jackson realized that an older actor was needed. And this is definitely one of those sliding door scenarios that you hear about once in a while. Something very similar happened with X-Men, as there was at one point whether Hugh Jackman was going to play the role or not. With Back to the Future, Eric Stoltz was originally cast to play Marty McFly, and they quickly transitioned over to Michael J. Fox as they realized through the dailies that things were not working. So, Brian, there's probably footage of Stuart Townsend as Aragorn that we are never, ever going to see, but I think it would be a really interesting exercise to see what exactly wasn't working, because having seen Viggo Mortensen, and it's pretty amazing to think about the fact that the Viggo Mortensen joined this movie when it was already shooting. He had never met Peter Jackson before, hadn't even read the books, but it was Viggo Mortensen's 11-year-old son who is the chief instigator in convincing Mortensen to sign on as Aragorn. And I would like to point out, Brian, that if Viggo Mortensen's son was 11 years old in 2001, he is probably about the same age as Viggo Mortensen was when he started to film Lord of the Rings, and now I feel really old.
Yeah, wow, that makes me think I'm kind of close in age to his son. Wow, but yeah, it wouldn't have made sense for Stuart Townsend, because look, I mean, despite his age at the time, I don't know his exact age, he was probably, late 20s, early 30s. This role is supposed to be a grizzled, not necessarily old veteran, but in his 40s, been there, done that. He's a hunter. He's seen a lot of shit. He's weary. He definitely needed a beard. That's for sure. He needed that weary older man beard, and Viggo Mortensen nailed that too perfectly. I don't know. It would have been weird to see a younger person play Aragorn, because it's supposed to be designed that way. I don't know if I don't know if it was one of those things where Peter Jackson was like, "Oh shit, I made a big mistake," or was like, immediately noticed it. But I would have noticed it immediately in the casting because when I'm reading this story and I'm reading the script, I'm thinking like this dude is like an older dude. And there's some other things too that I didn't even notice about the character. Like this time around, I noticed and I picked up on he was an orphan, and his parents are dead, and he grew up with the elves. So that's why he's got this deep connection with the elves and the elvish world and stuff like that. So I thought that was really cool that I didn't even pick up on, and it makes sense that he's so much older, and everyone still looks younger than him because the elves don't age. So I thought that was the right move because if you had Stuart Townsend in there, he would have just blended in kind of a little bit, looking like an elf, I think.
I can definitely see that, and I think Viggo Mortensen brings a weariness to this role that is desperately needed. And the thing that I appreciate so much about that casting is that he is so much a bridge of the first half to the second half of the movie, because the first half is almost completely focused on that. So I really appreciated the fact that they were able to do that and to have him play this role so specifically, and for him to carry the burden here. And one of the things that I want to mention here is that John Rhys Davies, who we talked about on Superhero Pantheon, and our love for John Rhys Davies in one of the Incredible Hulk movies. He is the tallest of the actors, but he is 6'1", and I tell you, Brian, you would never know it in watching this movie. And part of the trick of this movie is just being so impressed at the way that they absolutely nailed every shot of the actors together and getting the height disparities accurate. I have a deep admiration for what this movie was able to do just for that alone.
Yeah, it's filled with it. It's so amazing the way they did it, and it's not necessarily CGI. You know what I mean? They do a lot of close-ups of faces, and when you do a lot of deep close-ups on faces and you put that on a big screen in a movie theater, it looks larger than life. So you make the character seem larger than life in perspective, and then you cut a close-up to a small hobbit. It puts that disparity, like you said, and the discrepancy, and that makes sense, even though, the guy that plays Gimli is like 6 feet tall. And the other thing, too, that really helps is the makeup and the way that they put his makeup together, and he looks like the way that his face looks, it looks like a pudgy, small dude, you know what I mean? Which is a dwarf. And the way they do it, and then there's a lot of close-ups of Gimli, but it's effective, and then when they do a next shot of Gimli or something like that, he's pulled back, and it's like a stand-in, or like maybe a CGI shot where they have the stand-in and they put his face over a little bit, but it adds to the effect, so it's filled with that, and especially with the hobbits and stuff like that, it just adds to it, and it just makes it seem like, I don't know, like some of these filmmakers today can learn a lot in terms of cinematography. Like Ant-Man is a movie I think that learned a lot from the Lord of the Rings movies, because that perspective of Ant-Man being, like I said when we talked about that last year, when he's in the tub and you see it from his perspective, it's almost the same way they shoot the hobbits and the dwarves. So I thought, I mean, it's amazing that the dude's 6 foot tall and they made him seem like a short dude. And I wasn't convinced. Like I was convinced that they put in a small person in that role. You know what I mean? I thought, okay, they just had to cast it that way. And then I was starting to realize, like, that's the dude from Indiana Jones. I'm convinced of it, and I finally looked it up, and I was like, oh my god, that's the dude from Indiana Jones. And I was like, how in the hell did they do that? Of course, that's why you have the behind-the-scenes featurettes and to show you all the magic. But again, it's just that ingenuity for the time. You know what I mean? Not necessarily using CGI when they had all this CGI to use, but they just thought, let's do it practical, and they did it well.
So you mentioned the practicality and the way that they had to create some of the more technical complications of the movie. Before production began, it had to be determined whether computer effects could convincingly create battle scenes featuring thousands of warriors. That's something that we'll talk more about with numbers 2 and 3, Two Towers, and Return of the King. Peter Jackson invested his own money in the pursuit of this software, using the computers of his special effects company, Weta Digital, that had been purchased to make his previous movie, The Frighteners. Weta Digital pretty much became one of the more famous outlets for doing the computer effects for movies. They are still around to this day and do a lot of movies, and it's pretty amazing to think that before this it was basically Lucasfilm and Pixar, and that was about it. But now you have this third company, and I mean, it's just tremendously impressive. And the thing that's worth pointing out is that it's not just that they CGI'd everything to death. They also use so many miniatures and practical things, and just the visualization of this movie. even 20 years later, it still mostly holds up, and that's really impressive because there are some movies that you watch with some CGI and computers, and it doesn't look that great, or it looks janky, or I mean, there's so many movies that we could cite that we've already talked about, even superhero movies, but even 20 years later, there is a lack of jankiness to everything, and everything still looks real, and the computer effects look well hidden within the context of the movie. I mean, maybe a shot here or there doesn't work, but even the cave troll that they run into in the major battle, I mean, even that still looks very good 20 years later.
Yeah, and also like the makeup things they did, like with the feet, like adding the little touches like that, and not just adding like little hairs there, but they actually added like padding to the Hobbit feet and stuff like that, and you see the hairs. And then I love that the griminess of the character. I mean, not the elves, obviously, because they're very well kept and clean and stuff like that, but like the humans, you know what I mean, and the hobbits, they're very grimy and dirty, and everything looks real. You know what I mean? Not like this fake world. So I think adding that kind of added a lot to it, and mixing that with the CGI and then the magic of everything and the special effects going on, it just added this perfect mix to it. You know what I mean? So I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a miracle, but something about Weta, they just figured out the software and the rendering. Because, I mean, they went on to do, I think they did I'm almost convinced they did Transformers after this, after The Lord of the Rings and King Kong. I want to say it was Weta, not Lucasfilm, but yeah, because, I mean, if you look at Transformers, it was the same kind of effect, you know what I mean? It's smooth, and it looks real, and it's not clunky and janky, like you said, and perfect example from this exact same, I think it was the same year, Mummy Returns. That's got the worst looking CGI scorpion with the Rock's face on it I've ever seen in my life. And that's the same year that this movie came out, and this fucking, like the troll you're talking about, still looks incredible to this day 20 years later. So what does that tell you about
The CGI in The Mummy Returns, I remember even in 2002 thinking that it was really bad. Two of the more complicated scenes and parts of this movie, first are the prologue, which we've seen these kinds of prologues done in so many fantasy slash sci-fi movies. Even a movie like the Justice League tried to do this prologue, and some of them are more effective than others, but this one was really difficult because originally there was consideration given to have the narration done by Frodo. Then it was originally Gandalf, and eventually they decided to have Galadriel be the person who gives the narration, and I think this is a good choice because it gives Cate Blanchett just a little bit more to do, and the fact that she is an elf, I think, gets it across. But it's a very dense prologue, but I appreciate the fact that it's really about 5 minutes to get across all the essential information that you need to in order to understand this world and understand what's going on at the beginning. But then what I appreciate is the fact that they go back to the flashbacks a couple of times in the movie, and then they get into a little bit of the specifics with the ring, as well as just understanding how this happened and why the ring wasn't thrown into the fire, so to speak. And that prologue could have just been a complete disaster, but I think it really gets across the movie very well. It's amazing to think how many decisions got made on this movie that were right, and if any one of them was proven wrong, then this could have failed terribly. From the casting to the decision to shoot all three movies at the same time, to the way they start the movie, to other scenes, it still amazes me 20 years later that they made a lot of correct decisions, because I even think about the Hobbit movies just a few years later, and they made 3 or 4 really terrible decisions, and it basically ruined those movies. But in this case, they got it right in almost every case.
Yeah, it's rare. It happens, but it's rare. Sometimes everyone's just clicking on all cylinders and making the right decisions. But I think Kate Blanchett was really the best decision because there's something about her voice that just has this elegance to it. You know what I mean? It's like she takes the dialogue and elevates it. You know what I mean? Same thing with Thor Ragnarok. You put someone else in that role, it comes off a little hokey and a little, you know what I mean, a little too weird. You know what I mean? You put Kate Blanchett in that role, it adds something to it. She'll add some, so there's some presence to it and make it a little more heavier in the weight of the dialogue. So it just made it seem much more important when she talks. And I know that it sounds weird to say that, but there's something about her voice when she reads dialogue. She could be reading like your shopping list, you know what I mean? And she can sell it. But that's just the way that she sounds, you know, and that's why she makes the money that she makes, because she has this voice, you know what I mean, this commanding voice that can get your attention and tell a story. And then with that choir in the background humming and stuff, it set the right tone right off the bat, because it made it seem like we're in this far off fantasy world, but you know, there's all this history to it, and the history was easy to understand, and the rings, and all these rings were created at the beginning of time, so to speak, or the beginning of man, and how man, you know, took this power and got corrupted, basically. And that's basically the first 5 minutes of the movie, and it's explained fairly simply well, and you know, it hooks you in right off the bat. Like the first 5 minutes, like going into the Fellowship of the Ring, I had no knowledge of these movies or books or whatever. All I saw was the trailer, and knowing that they made three movies back to back. And I went into the first movie thinking, okay, what is this? And in the first 5 minutes, I'm hooked. And then after that, it was just like a big, joyous ride. You know what I mean? This cinematic ride. And it's all, you know, to that first 5 minutes, man. It's haunting, but it does show you the history of the Middle Earth. So I thought that was really
Definitely, and I think the other really hard scene is the Council of Elrond, which, by all accounts, was a complete nightmare. It is very different than what took place in the book. It was much more of a debriefing scene. In this case, it is basically like a dinner scene, a debate. Even though they're not eating, I can't imagine just the shots, the back and forth, having to, because it's all the characters in the same place, getting all the heights correct and all that. Even the writing of this, literally doing it during filming, rewriting some of this. And Boromir's speech at the council was read from a sheet of paper, sitting on Sean Bean's lap, as it was only given to him the night before. That's what you're dealing with, and it's just remarkable to me, because that scene kind of, I mean, it literally bridges the movie from what we saw in the first part, with just the hobbits and a little bit of Aragorn, and then into this fellowship, this group of people who are going to go out and destroy the ring. And that scene could, again, if it's a disaster, the movie fundamentally does not work. And I have such a deep admiration for what they were able to do, because so much of this is also hinged on a character that we haven't seen before. Boromir as a character was introduced to us in a couple of scenes, and then all of a sudden he's giving one of the most important speeches of the entire movie, and that takes some guts. And again, that's something that I deeply admire, and I think you could tell how effective Sean Bean was in this role, because when it came time to cast Ned Stark, one of the most important roles in Game of Thrones, they went with him, and he's the only person who is in both Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think he is absolutely the person that you want in both of these franchises and in these distinct roles. So, yeah, I mean, it's remarkable to think about Sean Bean in this role, and kind of dying in similar fashions in both as well.
Yeah, I people think that this started the trend, but actually I think the trend started technically, I guess, in GoldenEye, right? Because I guess the trend would be dying in the first part of every franchise that he stars in, right? So he does die in GoldenEye, but you know, GoldenEye is probably the most overrated Bond movie that people love, and I'm saying that, you know, with some controversy. Yeah, and we can talk about that at a later date, but Sean Bean did a great job, man, because he comes in and brings like this heavy weight to it all, and he kind of represents kind of like the failure of man, and like he feels that failure too, because he knows that his ancestors, or you know, Aragorn's ancestor, failed in that moment, and that he thinks that maybe he can take the ring and take control and bring everything right. And you know, that whole speech that he goes through, it was great, you know, the way they put that together. And I think what really helps in that scene is that they film it in a circle, and it's really easier to intake and digest visually, because it's basically you're just going in a meeting in a circle, and then when everyone, you know, whoever has something important to say, they'll come to the middle. So it's visually okay, so we see the person in the middle with the table in the middle. You know, it comes off really well visually. So I think that's why it comes off really well. And then that money shot, when you see all nine of them together, and then they do that CGI bit where they throw in the actor's face over the stand-ins, and you actually see the scale of everything and how tall and how short the hobbits actually are in that scene. I thought that was really great, and then everything's just set off from there. So it's probably one of the more important scenes in the movie, and then you get to see like everyone's varying opinions on the ring. I thought that was really interesting, the different cultures almost on how to approach this worldwide issue. And the fact that they have to come together in this small group, I thought was very significant. It didn't really hit me until, I don't know, like, I guess recently, but, they can't go out with a big army to go and destroy this ring because it's just going to draw all this attention. They have to do it in secret pretty much because they have to sneak in. So I think that was kind of the thing that really didn't click with me at the time when I was a kid. Like, why don't they just send an army, right? But they tried that before. In the first 5 minutes, they show that they tried an army to destroy the ring, and that didn't work. So they got to go small, and I think that was the thing that they really kind of emphasized, that they have to go in a small group and kind of go incognito to get the job done.
Well, and I think this movie, it's not quite a heist movie, but it definitely resembles a heist movie in a lot of ways because of the execution and some of the planning that is going on. But I think from a visual standpoint, I mean, the world, it's visualization and world building. Those are the things. That's why this movie works so well right from the beginning. And those are the things that struck me when I first saw this, because at the time, I don't think I was necessarily as into as many genres of movies as I am into now. Like, as a 16, 17-year-old, I was not the type of person who was going to see something that was as pure fantasy as this. And while I understand that Lord of the Rings has a lot of fans from the books, and Tolkien is one of our most famous and most important authors in history, I think that the thing that this franchise did is it really made fantasy more mainstream, and I think there is a clear connection between these Lord of the Rings movies that came out in the first half of the century, and then Game of Thrones being able to come out and also be a global phenomenon as this movie franchise was. So I think for me personally, it was a game changer, and I certainly think that it made other people realize how legitimate these movies were, because even though Return of the King is the movie that won all of the Academy Awards, all of these movies got nominated for Academy Awards in the technical categories, but also for screenplay, for Best Picture. It's very rare to see fantasy and to see such genre-specific movies get nominated like this. And for Return of the King, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks, for this to get real credit for innovating the film industry and be rewarded with 11 Academy Awards, to me is incredibly impressive. And I think that is a testament to the hard work of not just Peter Jackson, not just the cast, but the people that created the miniatures and the costume designers and the set designers and all of those individuals, and the entire country of New Zealand, which probably deserved an Academy Award as well. So Brian, tell me about your first time seeing this movie and some of what you remember.
Well, like I said, I had no history of Lord of the Rings. All I saw was the trailer earlier in the summer and it was like 3 movies back to back, 2001, 2002, 2003, and I was like, what? Wow, okay, back to back to back, okay. So I just figured they're going to destroy the ring in the first movie, and then it's going to be the repercussions of the next 2 movies, because I didn't know shit, right? So I go into this movie, and not only that, I'm going into this movie in this movie theater that just got bought out, right? Because it was originally General Cinemas. General Cinemas does not exist anymore. It went out in the late 90s. This was the transition. So it was bought out by this independent film chain here in LA, or probably more than LA, Carl Laemmle, the Laemmle Theater Company. So they bought that theater out, and they just changed the name over. So it was a new owner, new experience. I was going in, I was like, this is General Cinema. They just changed the name on everything and on the board and everything. But I do remember the popcorn being bomb. Like, it's the best popcorn I've ever had in any theater in my life. And when AMC took over that theater about 8 years ago, they changed the popcorn, and I was like so disappointed. That's the one thing I missed from that goddamn theater, was the best fucking popcorn I ever had in a movie theater. And Fellowship of the Ring was the first time I had that popcorn. So yeah, and it was weird because it was an independent theater. So this wasn't like going to the mall with the big crowd. This was like a smaller type crowd because no one ever came to this theater. or at least no one did in 2001. So it was really crazy, small crowd, but like it was like a coffee kind of crowd because this was like an independent chain. So yeah, and then like I said, the first 5 minutes I'm in, I'm hooked, and then I didn't realize it was 3 hours until the movie was over, and I was like, I thought there's more. It feels like there's more. Like it didn't feel like 3 hours to me. So that I credit to the editing, like I said, the pacing of this movie, and then afterwards I was like, okay, what how do I find out more? And then very little internet at the time, but what I was able to find, I found out that it was the cartoon movie by Ralph Bakshi. So I digested that and I watched that, and you realize that like Peter Jackson does take a lot of some of the ideas and the visuals from that cartoon, but unfortunately that cartoon ran out of money halfway through or mostly through the production, right? So they had to stop halfway through. So the ending of the animated version of Lord of the Rings ends in the middle of the Two Towers, unfortunately. And then Warner Brothers would go on to produce another cartoon. They'll get the Return of the King, which was supposed to be like the pseudo follow up. So I watched that and digested that, and then I actually read one of the books. I read Two Towers because I just couldn't wait to find out what was next. And Two Towers to this day is the only Lord of the Rings book I've ever read, which is so weird because it's the middle chapter. Knowing me, I'd do something weird like that. But yeah, and I was just hooked, man, because I loved the characters, I loved the music. When the DVD came out, I watched it like crazy, and I couldn't wait for Two Towers. I was really hooked, man, and I just loved the cinematic feel that it gave me. And yeah, it was awesome. And then seeing the Academy Award nominations, it was weird to see that because I was never like the kind of kid to watch movies based on like Oscar nominations and stuff like that. But this was the first time that the worlds were kind of crossing over. It was like big budget and Oscar worthy. So that was kind of the first time that I'd experienced that. You're just gonna get 6 files now.
So I remember watching this movie for the first time on January 1st, 2002, and at that point I was not into fantasy. And I basically debated, did I want to go see Harry Potter or did I want to see the first Lord of the Rings? Because the other strange thing is that I think franchise filmmaking was really coming into its own in the first 10 years of the century. I think people have gotten so used to the Marvel model that people forget about the fact that these kinds of things didn't happen, where you were going to get a first movie and you knew there was going to be a second movie and there was probably going to be a third movie, and in Harry Potter's case it was going to go on and have 8 movies in total. So it was very unusual. So I knew going into this that it was going to almost be more like a television show than a movie. And I think the thing that just really connected with me and why this movie works so well, I think the prologue puts you in a really good place, and I just like the way that things just slowly develop, and that can sometimes sound like an insult, but I think in this case, I think when I've watched other fantasy series and fantasy shows that don't work, it's hard to connect to the characters because some of them will introduce like a million different characters and will introduce all of these different concepts to the world. And Lord of the Rings spends the first hour in the Shire, and I think it really works. And you see the Shire not as a place or a setting, but you see it as a real world. I mean, the thing that I love so much about this movie is the use of wide shots and the way that you can see everything that is going on geographically. You can see what the Shire looks like. You see when they go underground. You see what all that looks like with wide shots. And that's the thing that I think action movies sometimes don't do a good job of, is let you see the geography of a particular place. And I think this movie, at all times, you know what's going on. You know where the characters are. And even that final battle scene, there's a great one-shot where they just track over the battle as different main characters are running towards it, and they let you see exactly where the different people are and where the orcs are. I just really loved the world building and the way that they make you invested in these characters right from the start. And that's not something that's easy to do when you are in a fantasy realm. But I think they, especially when you have Ian McKellen, you can't help but compare it to the Obi-Wan Kenobi and Alec Guinness. You just can't. I mean, they serve this almost the same purpose, and they both die. We know Ian McKellen will return in the future movies, but I just really appreciated the fact that They slowly introduced the characters, and they slowly introduced you into this world, and they never made it seem like it was something hard to understand. Like a layperson can come in and watch these movies having never read any of Tolkien, and they can really appreciate it. And even when I watched the Hobbit movies, I don't think that was the case. I felt like there were things that they took from the Silmarillion that just did not connect. But everything in this movie and all the subsequent movies, it really, I think it connects with the audience, the idea of friendship and the idea of working together. And I think these are universal themes. But as you get older, I think you start to appreciate some of the things that the old characters are going through, past mistakes they've made, especially in the case of Boromir and Aragorn and even Gandalf to an extent. So at the time, I just remember really liking this. And I'm going to make a judgment by the end whether I think this is still my favorite of the three. But I have an appreciation in different ways for all three of them. But I think Fellowship of the Ring is my favorite of these three movies.
Yeah, for me, as of right now, it's still Return of the King because I feel like it just has these great climactic moments that kind of just build up over the three movies. But yeah, I can totally see why you appreciate, especially the world building, and then you're right, it totally takes its time at the beginning to get you where it needs to go. And then, they take the time for you to connect to Frodo, you know what I mean? Especially Frodo. I mean, they really want you to feel like by the end of the first movie, there's this weight and this burden on his shoulders that he can't lift. And he feels like he has to do it alone by the end of the movie, and then that Sam has to join him because Sam has this vow to keep him alive, and he probably needed him to keep him alive in the next two movies. So, yeah, it's just a lot of cool themes that they play with, and then especially, you're right, growing up years later, seeing especially, like, I mean, Aragorn is really, I mean, it really opened my eyes to his arc because I didn't really pick up on the fact that he was an orphan until this latest watch through, and then everything just makes sense because he doesn't want to be, it was almost like the Lion King. He's trying to deny his destiny. He wants to hide his past. He doesn't want to be the king that everyone thinks he's going to be, or expects him to be, because he doesn't want to fall into the same trap. He doesn't want to make the same mistakes, and then that's totally understandable. And especially with like having this legacy of like dead parents, and there's like a history there too, and then growing up with the elves. I thought his arc is much more magnified now, especially now that I'm older, and you see these different characteristics, and then how people respond and psychology and stuff like that. And then Boromir, he feels this weight too because he feels like he needs to, step up because, Gondor has no king, they mentioned, right? Or they have a leader, but not necessarily a king or whatever. And then he feels like he's got to fulfill. I mean, you find out in the second movie, and especially the third movie, that he's going to fulfill this destiny that his father wants him to have. And there's this idea that if he has the ring, that he thinks he can do good and win the war and kill Sauron and all them, and Sauron and all them, and he's just wrong, and then it just pays him, it pays the price at the end because his greed and corruption, that is representative of man. Obviously, that's the whole thing. Man is corruptible and evil, and that's why the ring was never destroyed when we should have destroyed it in the first place. That whole idea, he represents that, and him dying at the end of the movie really sets the tone. It really sets the stakes, especially like the first time I watched this movie in the theater, seeing Gandalf die, I was like, holy shit, they killed off like the main leader. Like, they seem so lost now. You know what I mean? And that's the point, because it's supposed to like break them apart. Despite their strength and the original idea of this going through the journey together, they're gonna break apart at the end, but they're still gonna have this journey and destroying the ring and whatever. So that was a really big, heavy moment. And then seeing Boromir die, it had the same effect. I was like, holy shit, they killed off the other main dude. Like, what are they gonna do now? Everything was just so scattered at the end of this movie, and I was like, damn, they really like left it, wide open. Because, like I said, I had no idea what the hell was gonna come and what the storyline was, and the fact they split off into these three different storylines for the next movie. So I thought that was, it's really set the tone, and I was really excited by the end of this movie to watch the next one. So I thought it did a really good job, and it had me hooked. So credit to that. And then, especially like, and you mentioned the building of the relationships, and you really see what's to come, especially with Merry and Pippin. I think that's what they really did well, I think, is like they built them up as these comedic sidekicks, or R2D2, C3PO, Laurel and Hardy. I know that's a dated reference, but you know what I mean? The slapstick side comedy duo. And then their whole arc by the end. I mean, they're so crucial to Two Towers. It's like it's unbelievable. Like I really don't think that the war would have been won if it wasn't for those two convincing. We'll talk about that next week, but they really had a really big part in Two Towers. So I thought that was a really cool arc. To start them here is like these jokesters. They're not even supposed to be on the journey, and they're kind of annoying, and they get in the way. But then you see Boromir defend his and save his life, defend his life and lose his life defending his life for those two hobbits. So it was just really interesting to see how these characters affect each other, and then the way that they affect each other going down the journey that they're about to have. Because I mean, you see this full turn of like these characters. So I thought that was a really cool comparison to see them from the beginning of the journey, and then by the end of it, there's these, they get this courage and this bravery out of them that you didn't really expect.
I think that what I connected to so much, especially on this rewatch, was the idea that Boromir was developing a relationship with Merry and Pippin even before that moment when he sacrifices his life for them. And it's not something that I think really clicked with me until this latest rewatch, because this isn't something that comes out of nowhere. This is something that where they have even just a couple scenes of them building a rapport with each other. And even though the actual time that we see these characters together as a fellowship is about 45 minutes to an hour, if that, the reality is that they are very much together within the context of the movie. They are in it for like a month or so. I think they said the journey was about 40 days. So that's at least 40 days that they spent and built a rapport with each other. And I think that to be able to do that in a movie of this size, you couldn't do that if this was a 2 hour movie. You just couldn't have those scenes. But I think even just having those moments, and then having the POV of Boromir getting killed and having the arrows go in him, we see so much of that through Merry and Pippin's eyes, and I think that's just really effective. I think that that's really good storytelling, because I think it makes you connect with those characters in a way that you haven't necessarily before, and I think it makes you realize the weight of Boromir's death and the sacrifice that he is in fact making for these hobbits. And it's the first sign that man is going to redeem themselves in the end. I think the other thing that I really appreciated, just in a specific way, is the way that they slowly introduce the characters, and then you build up to the climax on Elrond when they basically introduce you to everyone. But I think one of the things that I always forget in watching this movie is that Liv Tyler is only in this movie for like 5 minutes, but she plays probably the most important role, because Frodo is on the brink of death, and usually in a situation like this, it's the damsel in distress, but in this case, it is our main character who is literally on death's door, and it's this person who we have not really seen before, played by somebody who's might be the most famous person, maybe the second most famous person in this movie after Ian McKellen. But she's in it for 5 minutes, but she's the one that takes him on the journey. She floods the orcs, and she has probably one of the most iconic line deliveries in this movie by when she says, "If you want him, then come and claim him." So that's always something that I think, even though she is not a part of the Fellowship, and even though her name is prominently featured on the poster, and she has such an important role to play, and she feels like she is very much a part of this world, even though you don't see her for very much. And I think that's also something that you have to give credit to. And they allude to things that have happened with Aragorn in the past, but they don't necessarily explain it yet. And I don't think that you necessarily have to explain everything. If the actors are doing a good job, and if your screenplay is doing well, then you don't have to reveal everything right at the top. You could save that for future movies, as they certainly did. So I definitely wanted to mention Liv Tyler's Arwen in this movie, because it would be really easy to forget her, but I think that she plays a really crucial role in the context of this movie, and some of the marketing too.
Yeah, the one thing I noticed too is like they kind of slowly mentioned that they were like 4 days in a journey behind before they got to the elf or Elrond, right? and he had already been stabbed at that point, Frodo. So my thinking is like she probably didn't even sleep. You know what I mean? She probably just gutted it, or you know what I mean? Just 2 days straight, keeping him barely alive, just to get to get to her home, to cure him, man. So that really had me thinking, like, and the fact that the way they shot it, that made her seem like she was like probably the best horse rider in all the movies. You know what I mean? Because she was just like gutting it. You know what I mean? She was going super fast. So that really clicked in my head that she probably didn't sleep those 2 days and running from the wraiths and then flooding them. I thought that was great, and I kept thinking, like, God, why wasn't she part of the Fellowship, man? And I guess that's probably one of the criticism we'll get to in a second. But I thought thinking back now, she would have been great, but I guess Tolkien didn't write it that way, obviously. But I thought she would have been a great mix to it because I mean, obviously it's all dudes, so that really hurts. You know what I mean? And the lack of strong female characters. I mean, you do have Kate Blanchett and Liv Tyler, but it's seriously lacking and most of the time of this movie. So and the whole well, it gets better in Two Towers and Return of the King, but especially in this movie, you know what I mean? And I just wish he was part of it, but it's obviously not part of the story they wanted to tell or Tolkien wanted to tell. So it's understandable.
I will say, even though there are no females involved in the Fellowship of the Ring, and I think that that is problematic in its own way, I do appreciate the fact that they don't have to resort to them necessarily being damsels in distress either. I did appreciate that. And something else that I want to mention that I really enjoyed about this movie is just getting those hero moments right. And this is something that when we talk about superhero movies or we talked about the Avengers, there is this iconic shot where you just go around and you see all the Avengers, and it's this really important moment that has been used in montages all over the place because it is just such a hero moment. And the thing that I connected to in this movie is after the Fellowship is formed, the first time that you hear the iconic, the main Lord of the Rings theme, you don't hear the full orchestra until that Fellowship is formed, and then you see them slowly starting to walk through the mountains, and you get a shot of each of the characters. And I think that it's kind of cheesy, but I think those moments really work because it's part of fantasy and sci-fi storytelling to have these iconic scores and to have those hero moments. So that's something else that I really liked because I think you're just seeing these characters as the heroes of the movie. And Howard Shore probably does not get enough credit for how good this score is because I think whenever we think of the iconic scores, I think we think of John Williams. I think that is just the first name that comes to mind. And I think even though I can't speak to a lot of Howard Shore's other work offhand, but this is as good of a score as you could possibly get because it's not just the main Lord of the Rings theme. It's the fact that you have different sounding themes and you have all of these different and great musical moments throughout, and they're distinct and they capture the emotions of the movie when things are lighter, when things are heavier. So yeah, Howard Shore's score is absolutely phenomenal, and from what I understand, a lot of people love to write to this score as well because of the different ambient noises and sounds.
Totally. I mean, in the extended cut, they really show the hobbits in that concerning hobbit section, and I love that hobbit theme. I mean, I love that to death because I love the light flute playing, and then it just brings this nice relaxing type of feel, and it's just like I don't know what it is, man, but he nailed, I think, the out of all the themes in these movies, I think the Hobbit one is like the best one. I mean, it just feels so at home and wholesome and natural, and you just, I don't know, it just brings a smile to my face when I see that scene, and with the music especially. I relate to that a lot, just smoking and eating and being barefoot, and yeah, I get it. I totally get that lifestyle, man. It's a hippie lifestyle, but I mean that's what it was. It was Tolkien being a hippie back in the day, so I get it, and I just really enjoyed that flute playing, and then especially when he goes dark, when you hear the Sauron theme, you know what I mean? It's dun 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 dun, and it's just this ominous evil theme, and then you hear like the stuff in that sound that he makes when you hit the ironclad sound, the iron clanking. He added that to it to make it even more ominous, as if like the army was building and building and building in the background. So just little things like that, it really set the mood. And to me, in the last 20 years, it's this soundtrack. Not just Fellowship, but like Lord of the Rings as a whole, all three movies, the trilogy. This and then Dark Knight are like the top two, I think, iconic soundtracks of the last 20 years. I'd say Inception might be number three, maybe. But to me, those are just the most iconic, and then you just hear it, and everything just clicks, and everything just kind of flows. And I could totally see why people write to that, the Lord of the Rings music. I don't necessarily write to it, but I just love, especially turning that scene on and just relaxing and watching that stuff with the hobbits, man. So I get it. It just works so well, even 20 years later, visually and then musically. Howard Shore just nailed it. I don't know how, but he nailed it because like it just sets this mood, and it just, you can hear the epic fantasy through it all. You know what I mean? And a lot of tracks, a lot of these house tracks that they develop these like in-house music, stock music. They use a lot of the Lord of the Rings music as like this basis, and then use that. You know what I mean? So it's been really influential over the last 20 years. So credit to him.
Brian, is there anything else that you wanted to mention about things that still work about this movie 20 years later? Anything that comes to mind before we go on? Because we have a list of things that maybe don't quite work, but that list is much, much shorter.
I would say just like the one thing I did notice, because this is just my personal preference, but just shooting stuff in the dark. But when they were in the mines of Moria, you're limited to no light, obviously, so they had to come up with this, artificial lighting here and there. But I thought they pulled it off well. And I thought that even like I mentioned before, the CGI for the Balrog, right? 20 years later, it still looks ominous and creepy and evil, and it does. I mean, it is CGI, but it just looks like well designed. You know what I mean? And I compared to the Rock and the Scorpion King, or not the Scorpion, or the Mummy Returns, and just the same time, and yet one terribly ages, and the other one ages well. So that just shows you how well they were able to do CGI in the dark 20 years ago and make it effective. And yeah, and just the other thing too is like the close-ups they use. You know what I mean? Like the two scenes that I want to point out in particular, the ones where they go to the inn and they meet that bearded dude at the inn, and the way they shoot it, they shoot down at the hobbits from his perspective, and then they shoot up up to him to make it, to give you that perspective. And I thought that was well done. And then every time you see Ian McKellen, it's like these close-up of his face a lot, and he's a short dude. You know what I mean? He's under 6 feet tall. To me, that's a little short. You know what I mean? And he looks like a giant in this movie. Like every single like exterior shot, he looks like he's 6.5, maybe 7 feet tall almost. You never know, but they shot him so well in this movie. Like they did it right.
And not even just compared to the hobbits, but to everyone else as well. They just make Gandalf seem like a total giant, and that is something that's very much appreciated. We're going to talk a lot about lighting because the Helm's Deep battle is a point of comparison and contention to a prominent episode of Game of Thrones, and I'm going to have a kind of mini rant about that, but I just can't tell you how much I respect the decisions that they made about lighting. We really haven't talked about Elijah Wood as Frodo, and I feel like we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to him to talk about it, because this, when Elijah Wood passes on, this is going to be the first line in his obituary. Even though he has gone on to do other movies, other projects, some obscure TV shows, this is the movie that he is going to be known for now and forever. And it is a very difficult role to play because you are trying to balance him being young and naive, but he also has to be just intelligent enough to make some of the decisions that he does. The decision to take the ring, the way that he figures out what the password is on when they go underground. This is not easy to play, and it could very easily have not worked. But I think Elijah Wood is able to capture all of those things. He's able to capture both the naivete of being a hobbit who has never left the world, but also capture the resourcefulness of being a Baggins, which is something that tradition is known for. And I didn't necessarily appreciate the Sean Astin casting until much later on, even until Return of the King. But I always have appreciated the way that Elijah Wood has played this role. And I think my appreciation only grows. I think he gets even better in the next two movies because he adds kind of this nuance of menace and fear and sadness and fatigue. So he's just adding to the layers. But Elijah would definitely wanted to make sure we mention him because he is such an important point of this movie because he is the ring bearer.
Yeah, you'll slowly see his transition. Like at the beginning of the movie, he seems like a normal hobbit, but then by the end of Fellowship, you start to see that weariness. You know what I mean? And you can almost start to see a little bit of the bags under the eyes, the blank stares, that guilt, that weight. It's starting to become heavy on him, and it gets really heavy the next two movies. And that it's that arc, you know what I mean? And it's that great arc to see his journey being so not so naive, but he's like you mentioned, like a smart hobbit, one of the smarter ones, to being a hero and the weight of that, and even that decision to abandon everybody. I mean, that's a big time decision. You know what I mean? And in that moment, he realizes that I think it's better off if I do this on my own and not endanger these people. And that's kind of the decision he makes at the end, and that Sam kind of follows him up, and says, "I'm not leaving you," and almost drowns doing it. And the two are set off, and then you see Mordor in the distance, and everything's kind of set the table for the next two movies. But yeah, it's definitely hard to play. You can tell because especially that weird accent. You know what I mean? It's a cross between what British or English and some kind of like maybe New Zealand. It's like some kind of cross between there maybe. And he's not he's an American, so you know what I mean. And it was interesting the way he approached the accents, and then yeah, just the way, I always thought that his wig would have fallen off, it just didn't match up. But I was surprised that throughout the three movies, like his wig actually was consistent throughout. That was one of the things I noticed, because like, man, his hair doesn't really grow much, and then it grows a little bit, and then it's shorter here and there. But that was one of the things I noticed about Frodo Baggins.
All right, let's get to a couple things that don't necessarily work for me specifically. And Brian, if you have something you want to add, of course, very similarly. I think the Hobbit humor is just too broad. And I think this might be a difference between being 16 years old and kind of feeling either neutral or maybe a little bit positive and watching this at 34. I just, it's a little too silly at times. And I think in particular, Merry and Pippin, those are characters that I have a very complicated relationship with because I don't necessarily like them in this movie. I don't necessarily like the roles that they fulfill in Twin Towers, and we'll discuss more of that next week. But yeah, I have always struggled with the Hobbit humor because on the one hand, it is broad, but on the other hand, I don't want this movie to be a depressing bore either. So I understand that its purpose is to keep things on the lighter side, and you can't make pop culture references. You really can't be sarcastic in the modern sense. So basically, you are restricted to this very broad, kind of cartoonish type humor. With at the beginning with the fireworks and kind of the hair goes all over the place, and they have ashes on their bodies and whatnot. And later talking about second breakfast and Pippin not even knowing where they're going and why they're doing it. So I get why it's there, but it's definitely something that wears on me a little bit.
It's okay for me, but I did feel that a little bit when they go down the hill, and then they do like the unintentional penis joke with the broken carrot. You know what I mean? I get what they were going for. They're supposed to be comic relief, and I get that. But I that's why I kind of like their arc, because they go from this goofiness to these heroes by the end. So maybe that's kind of the point. But I did enjoy the Hobbit stuff at the beginning, like in the extended version, where they go a little into it more about what a Hobbit is and their lifestyle and stuff like that. So I think if you contain it in the lighter half of the movie, the lighter side of the movie, it's fine. I'm glad they kind of cut a lot of that humor out by the second half of the movie when everything gets kind of heavy and serious. So I do like that balance. But for me, the only thing that kind of didn't work for me is just the lack of female characters. At least the two that they had were strong. But I just felt like, again, like this is, I guess this is the byproduct of a story written by a dude in the '60s. You know what I mean, with that kind of thinking. So that's why you have 9 male characters setting out on a journey, when you have this strong female character who's probably the best horse rider out of all of them not joining them on the journey. You know what I mean? So that's what kind of I picked up on this latest time around. It's like, damn, she should have been on the journey, man, because I think she would have helped a lot. but then it's just the way it is. So that's kind of what I think this whole thing is missing. You see a lot of that too in The Hobbit, the first one, Unexpected Journey. It's like almost all dudes. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, I get it. It's fantasy and it was written a long time ago, and you're trying to stay, loyal to the source material, and I get that. But yeah, it needed more strong female characters. I'm glad we got Kate Blanchett, and especially you get more of her in the extended edition. So at least we got that, and at least that she had the voiceover at the beginning of the prologue, so that kind of had something to it. But I just feel like there's something lacking there with the female characters.
I would totally agree with you on that point. I think the lack of female representation is something that bothers me in a lot of movies, and this one is no different. Even though this is 20 years ago, I just think that there had to be a way to improve it. And my guess is that in whatever form the Amazon series takes, is that they're going to try to incorporate stronger female characters into it. I don't know if necessarily. So the other thing that I wanted to mention was, as far as the extended editions go, I appreciate what they're trying to do, and I don't necessarily have a problem with these in principle, but I think that it has started this trend of extended editions and director's cuts, and we don't need extended editions and director's cuts for every movie. And Brian, I think you know what movie I'm referring to specifically, right? You know where I'm going with this?
Listen, man, it doesn't exist, okay? The Snyder Cut does not exist. It does not exist because if you need more money to finish it, it's not done. Therefore, it does not exist.
So, and the reason that I say this is that, to me, when you put a movie out, that is the ultimate representation of what it is. And if directors sometimes want to go back, I can understand that in some cases. Not every movie, though, deserves extended editions. And in particular, when you're talking about going to the movies, I would not want to sit there and watch a 4-hour cut of this movie. I definitely think this is better for home entertainment. And I appreciate what they're trying to do with some of these extended editions. Sometimes you just got to leave it alone. And so I feel conflicted because I do like that we got all the special features, and you could really see just the amount of work that got put into this, and you can really see why they ultimately did win 11 Academy Awards for Return of the King. But I don't think it set a great precedent for the future.
Yeah, I get that, and I kind of noticed that trend too. But when this one first came out, the extended edition, I was excited about it because it was long. To me, it's long anyway, so a little longer doesn't really, add anything to it for me. Because like the way I watch the Lord of the Rings movies now, anyway, is like I kind of watch them in sections. You know what I mean? Like I'll take a little break in between, even though like I think the pacing is still good. You know what I mean? It's still long, obviously. So I get that notion, but yeah, it's just I noticed the same thing. It's like I don't need like 4 versions of Blade Runner. You know what I mean? And like the only version I've seen doesn't even have the voiceover, so I'm cool with it. Either way, voiceover or not in Blade Runner, it doesn't matter. It's almost the same movie to me. But it's just another way to market and make different editions and sell you more of the same thing. And I get that, so it is what it is. But I still enjoy it because it plays out more like a long epic show anyway. And these movies are epic and long, and might as well just make them a little longer for the home entertainment audience. So I get why they did it. They made a lot of money, and these 3 movies are probably the most known extended director cut versions out there. You know what I mean? Because they're probably the most profitable. I think. I think they sold tons of the original DVDs. Because I remember seeing so many copies of those the green, red, and blue cover cases for the extended editions when I was younger, and they were all over the place, and my friends had them. So yeah, I think this is probably the more popular director's cuts out there, next to Superman 2, maybe, and the non-existent Snyder Cut.
Which we will hopefully never see. At this point, I'm at a point where I don't want to see the Snyder Cut, not because I don't want to see it, but because I just I want man babies to continue to be angry. That's where I'm at with this, and I genuinely think that this idea of the extended edition is something that can be interesting, but only under the right circumstances. And That's pretty much all I have to say about it. So, anything else that didn't work for you, Brian? Or are you ready to talk about the MVPs?
That's pretty much it. Let's hear your MVPs first, because I got one big MVP in mind, and I think you would probably have the same answer.
Okay, so here's the thing. For all three of these movies, I feel like we have to give it. You have to say Peter Jackson is the unquestioned winner of all three of these movies. He is the number one choice. Can we agree on that?
Yes.
So what we're gonna do is we're just I will say that Peter Jackson is the MVP for this movie, and I will also say it next week and the week after. But let's make this a little bit more interesting. Who is the on camera? Which performer is the MVP of this movie?
Ian McKellen, and that's just not because he got nominated for Best Supporting Actor in this movie, but because he holds. It feels like he holds the narrative together. He's the one who comes in. He's the one who visits visits the Shire. You know, being that audience perspective of experiencing the world for the first time, and he's giving you that eye as the visitor, and then he kind of, he's the one who finds out about the history of the ring. He's the one who brings them together. He's the one who sets off the journey for Frodo. He's the one who gets captured and then he escapes, and he's the one on the giant eagle, and then he's the one who sacrifices himself for the group. He does a lot in this movie. He carries almost the whole narrative of this movie to make you to make it make sense to you and figure it out. So I thought he did a great job of that, and he held it together. And like I mentioned before, the way they shoot him up close, you know what I mean, and then having him in the small set, making him seem like a giant, and then having him work with stand-ins, they just did it right with him. And to me, he sells this first movie so well, and he makes it work so well. And then by the time he, allegedly he dies, it's such a big loss. It feels like such a like a magnificent loss to the group, or the whole journey, because he feels like he was the one with, he was the compass. You know what I mean? And without the compass, it's like, what are you gonna do now? Like, what direction do we take now without our leader, practically? So, I thought he did a great job and led the way.
I hope that we disagree in these next two because I think it's a little bit more spread out, but it's really hard to disagree and say that anyone but Ian McKellen is the on-screen MVP because he is just spectacular in this role and what he is able to do and what he has to do over the course of the first 2.5, 3 hours of the extended cut. He has to be the bridge that builds this world, and he does it so well. And there's a reason that Ian McKellen got an Academy Award nomination. I believe that he should have won the Academy Award for his performance in this movie, because I think it's something that, again, without Ian McKellen in this role, if you cast somebody else, does this movie work? Does the movie end up as a complete disaster? I think there is a distinct possibility that even if you get every other role in this movie right, if you don't get the Ian McKellen one right, then the whole thing is just blown to bits and it doesn't work, because Gandalf is so important to how this movie functions. So I am going to agree with you this time, but I hope that we disagree next week, because I think when we talk about Two Towers, I think we will be able to go in a lot of different directions because the characters are a lot more spread out, and we can kind of talk about those situations more individually. So that is pretty much it for this week. We are going to do burning questions whenever we get done with a trilogy. It doesn't really make sense until we're done. So we will have burning questions in some episodes, but not others. But for right now, we are going to call it an episode this time. Any final thoughts, Brian, on the Fellowship of the Ring before we call it a day?
Yeah, I just can't believe that this came out a month after Harry Potter, like you mentioned earlier, and then I don't know, both were fantasy movies, and I felt like more so Lord of the Rings, I felt ushered us into the epic, tent pole, summer blockbuster or holiday blockbuster. It just kind of set the tone, I think, and it brought us into the modern era of filmmaking, or at least blockbuster tentpole filmmaking. Because I mean, God, some of these effects still hold up to this day, and in comparison to some of these movies in the last even 10 years, man, they can't even hold the candle. So I don't know what it is, but they just got it right with Weta and the CGI.
Yeah, I think this entire franchise is a miracle, and just what they were able to deliver in this first one, I think, speaks to that. And you can definitely make the argument that this trilogy, I think, really laid the groundwork for franchise filmmaking, as did the Harry Potter movies as well. It really laid the groundwork for what you saw eventually in the MCU just a few years later. And the other funny thing, Brian, is in thinking about this came out just 7 years before Iron Man, and that is just so bizarre to me because it feels like these two movies came out in different centuries and they did not.
Yeah, the 2000 to 2010 was a crazy, crazy time. Because, I mean, it just kind of was the beginning of one era, the end of another. And then stuff like this was transitioning us into this modern era. So that's a really crucial 10-year period. Actually, I would argue even from 2000 to 2008 was even more of a crucial period in those 8 years than the 10. So,
Certainly. So that is it for this week. Next week we will be discussing the Two Towers, the middle chapter in this trilogy, and then in 2 weeks we will be reviewing the Return of the King. Definitely make sure you go check out my podcast from 2 weeks ago, where we discussed the first half of season 5 of Breaking Bad, and then coming up in just about 3 weeks or so, you will hear Kevin Ford and I spend 2 hours discussing the second half of the 5th season of Breaking Bad. So you're getting a lot of discussions of interesting franchises and endings. So definitely go check that out on The Real World. For Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.
yeah, next week we get Chucky. Brad Dorff, baby. A day Dewey Dembella.